3 years ago, right after I gave birth to my son, Lucas, through a C-section, my husband disappeared. No calls, no messages, just silence. That same day, when I still couldn't even stand, my mother-in-law held my hand and said words that shattered me. She told me that my baby and I no longer had anything to do with their family and forced us out of the house in the cold night. I remember clearly what it felt like to hold my baby in the freezing air, the sound of the car door closing behind me, and the look in Jacob's eyes. He was sitting in the car, staring at me slowly but too afraid to open the door. All I could do then was hold my child, cry, and wonder how everything could change so quickly. 3 years later, while I was waiting for the bus with Lucas at a stop downtown, a black luxury car pulled up right in front of us. The window rolled down, a woman stepped out, and she looked at me for a long moment. She spoke in a firm voice, yet something about it felt familiar. "Emma, get in the car. I have something important to tell you." I followed her inside without having the slightest idea what awaited me. All I knew was this. Her words were about to change my life forever. But whether for better or worse, I still didn't know. If you enjoy real-life emotional stories and journeys of resilience like this, please subscribe to the channel so I'll have more motivation to continue sharing. Thank you for listening. I delivered Lucas through a C-section that lasted nearly 2 hours. When the doctor brought him close to me, I burst into tears, both from relief and from happiness. But even in that moment, I kept looking around, hoping to see Jacob standing there, smiling, holding my hand the way he had promised. He didn't show up. I called him all night. Every time the call went straight to voicemail, I felt my heart drop once more. I told myself he must have had an emergency at work or was on his way. I forced myself to believe that so I wouldn't fall apart. By the time I was discharged, I thought everything would be fine. I held Lucas in my arms, watching him sleep like an angel, and told myself, just get home, everything will be better. But when I stood at my husband's front door and pressed the doorbell, the door opened and I immediately knew something was wrong. Margaret, my mother-in-law, looked me up and down as if I were a stranger. There wasn't a trace of joy on her face at the sight of her grandson. She spoke bluntly, each word cold as ice. "You are no longer part of this family." I thought I misheard her. I tried to explain that Jacob never came to the hospital, that I had just given birth, that Lucas needed a place to rest. But her expression didn't change. I heard movement behind her and looked toward the driveway. Jacob was sitting in the car. His head was down, hands gripping the steering wheel, refusing to look at me. I called his name softly, almost whispering. He still didn't dare look up. Margaret stood blocking the doorway, her arms crossed. "You brought misfortune to this family. You and the baby need to leave, now." I tightened my hold on Lucas. My incision still hurt, my legs trembled, but her words hurt more than any wound. I stepped back down the stairs. The door shut right in front of me without the slightest hesitation. As I walked across the yard, their car engine started. I looked through the window. Jacob looked up for 1 second. Just one, and our eyes met. His eyes were full of fear, full of confusion, but not a spark of courage. I stood there, holding Lucas, watching their car disappear down the street. No one opened the door. No one turned back. No one asked if I was okay. It was just me, Lucas, and a freezing night in the city, where I once thought I had a family. That day, I learned that some wounds don't bleed, yet they stay with you for a lifetime. After the night I was thrown out, I carried Lucas and boarded the first bus I could find, just to get away from the place that made it impossible to breathe. I had no plan other than finding somewhere for the two of us to stay. A few days later, I found a tiny rented room in Aurora, only about 10 square meters with old damp walls and a dim yellow bulb on the ceiling. But at that time, it was enough, a small space for a crib for Lucas and a thin mattress for me. I signed the lease with what little savings I had left and promised myself to save every cent from then on. I started fixing clothes for the neighbors. My first stitches were so shaky I had to redo them 3 or 4 times, but I kept working until the customers were satisfied. Every night after Lucas fell asleep, I sat by the old sewing machine I had bought secondhand, praying it wouldn't break down. In the mornings, I worked as a kitchen helper at a small restaurant nearby. The owner, Mrs. Hattie, a kind but strict older woman who always wore a blue kitchen scarf, was the first person to ask me, "Are you all right, Emma?" I wasn't all right at all, but I nodded. She looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Try to hold on. The weather may be cold, but as long as people still have kindness, there will always be a place to stand." I never forgot those words. Mrs. Hattie wasn't talkative, but whenever I was exhausted, she would quietly pack extra food for Lucas. She knew I was poor, yet she never made me feel ashamed of it. Every day at work, I heard her grumble, "You're young, and you endure too much. But remember this, Emma. Being strong doesn't mean carrying everything alone forever." 3 years passed, and Lucas grew into such a gentle boy that I sometimes felt guilty. He rarely fussed, rarely demanded anything, and fell asleep as long as I held him. Every morning, seeing him smile gave me enough reason to keep going. Whenever he asked, "Mom, where's my dad?" my throat tightened, and I gave the same familiar answer. "He's working far away, sweetheart. He loves you very much." I knew I was lying, but I didn't want Lucas to grow up with the kind of wound I carried. I wanted him to believe he was loved, even if it was only from one side. Those 3 years were the hardest of my life, but they were also the years I learned how to stand firm, how to be a mother, and how to believe that even if the whole world turned its back on me, as long as I had my child beside me, I still had a place to return to. That day, I had just finished my shift in the kitchen. My shirt still smelled of oil, and my hands were burning from hours of washing dishes. Lucas clung to my legs, complaining nonstop about being hungry and sleepy. I stood at the familiar bus stop, where the wind always blew a little stronger than usual, and the pavement was always damp with evening mist. I counted the coins left in my pocket, just enough for 2 bus tickets and a cheap ice cream for Lucas. He looked up and asked, "Mom, is the bus coming soon?" I smiled to reassure him, even though I was exhausted myself. "It'll be here soon, sweetheart." And right at that moment, a sleek black luxury car slowly stopped in front of me. The windows were so darkly tinted that I couldn't see who was inside. I stepped aside, thinking they must have stopped in the wrong place. But then the window rolled down. A woman looked at me for a long moment. Her hair was neatly pinned up. Her features were sharp, yet her eyes were strangely warm. It took me a few seconds to recognize her. Aunt Helena. Aunt Helena, my mother's younger sister, the one who had moved to Canada years ago and whom I had only seen during a few holiday gatherings. I thought she had long forgotten about me, but now she was looking at me with an expression that trembled, as if she had found something she'd lost for years. "Emma." Her voice shook slightly. "Get in the car. I've been looking for you for days." I froze, partly from shock, partly because I couldn't believe this was real. A family member looking for me? After 3 years of my disappearing from everyone's lives? She opened the car door and spoke with that firm tone only older, seasoned adults have. "Don't hesitate. Get in. I have something very important to tell you. It's something about your parents." My heart tightened. It had been so long since anyone mentioned my parents. That one sentence was enough to make me unable to stand still for another second. I held Lucas and stepped into the car. The door closed, shutting out the cold outside. In that moment, I had no idea whether my life was about to turn a new page or fall into another kind of chaos. All I knew was that meeting was about to change everything. When the car pulled away from the bus stop, I held Lucas tightly in my arms. Aunt Helena sat beside me, saying nothing for a long while, as though she was trying to arrange heavy thoughts in her mind. Finally, she opened her bag and pulled out a thick stack of documents wrapped in a brown leather folder. "Emma, everything in here. You need to know all of it," she said. I opened the folder with slightly trembling hands. The first page stunned me. Company name, Land Pro Developments, a real estate and export corporation. I had only ever heard about it vaguely on the news. She looked at me and spoke slowly. Your parents were never poor, Emma. They built an entire company. But they chose to live simply to protect you. They were afraid you would be taken advantage of, so they wanted you to grow up like a normal person. It felt as though someone had pulled a curtain from my life. I grew up in a small house, with my parents always saying, "We're not wealthy." But apparently, that had been their choice. She then handed me another document, the inheritance trust papers. It stated clearly that there were 3 layers of protection. 1. Temporary management rights were held by Aunt Helena until I met the conditions to inherit the assets. 2. My biometric verification, including fingerprints and in-person confirmation at the bank. 3. A microscopic laser code engraved on the back of the rose quartz pendant my mother gave me before she passed away. I was speechless. I had worn that necklace for years. Even when I had been so poor, I had to sell my wedding ring. I still kept it. I never imagined it was the key to everything my parents left behind. Aunt Helena placed her hand on my shoulder, as if preparing me for something even harder. Emma, there's more. I looked up. She continued. 3 months after you gave birth to Lucas, the bank contacted me. Someone filed a request to withdraw the entire trust. They forged your signature. They even submitted a psychiatric report claiming you were unstable after childbirth, so you would be declared unfit to manage the assets. I felt my face heat up. I didn't need to guess who they were. She went on, calm but fiercely protective. With that kind of forgery, I'm sure you already know who did it. But don't worry. I stopped them in time. No one touched a single cent. I nodded, though it felt like my heart had dropped to the bottom of my chest. So all those years of struggling, it wasn't because I had nothing. It was because I had an entire fortune without knowing it. She looked at me for a long moment, then said the words I can still recall clearly to this day. They thought you had disappeared from this world. Emma, it's time for you to take back what's yours. Not to get revenge, but so you and Lucas can live the life your parents wanted for you. I looked out the window. The streets were just as busy as always, but everything inside me had changed. From that moment on, I knew my life was about to turn in a completely different direction, not only to reclaim what belonged to me, but to protect my son and to protect the kindness my parents had spent their whole lives building. That night, Aunt Helena brought Lucas and me to a high-end apartment in downtown Aurora. From the moment I stepped inside, I could hardly believe this was a place meant for us to stay temporarily. The apartment was spacious, clean, and featured large windows that overlooked the entire city. The glow of the night lights felt warm and strange. It had been so long since I'd felt safe walking into a home. She spoke gently, as if afraid the moment might overwhelm me. Emma, consider this your home until everything stabilizes. You deserve a better life than the one you've had these past 3 years. I couldn't say anything. I just held Lucas close. That very first evening, she had her assistant bring me a few sets of new clothes. Not luxurious designer outfits, but simple, comfortable clothes. Precisely the kind I liked. I showered, changed, looked at myself in the mirror. And for the first time in 3 years, I saw a different version of myself. Still me, but clearer, cleaner, as if I had picked up a piece of confidence I once lost. The next morning, while I was preparing breakfast for Lucas, Aunt Helena sat beside me. She didn't say much, but her eyes showed she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Emma, we'll need to work with the bank, with the lawyer, and then, when you're ready, we'll meet Jacob's family again. Hearing that made my hands pause for a moment. For 3 years, just thinking about them made my chest tighten. But strangely, this time, I didn't feel afraid. I didn't tremble. All I felt was a quiet calm. I whispered, Auntie, should I really face them? I'm afraid I'll lose my strength. She placed her hand on mine, squeezing gently. "Emma, this isn't revenge." "Then what is it?" She looked straight into my eyes. "This is justice. You're simply taking back what's yours and protecting your son. When you're standing firmly on your feet, you don't need to hurt anyone. Just live with kindness and life will begin to shine again." I looked down at Lucas eating his toast, his chubby face smeared with a bit of butter. Just that image alone was enough to tell me I needed to be stronger. I lifted my head, took a deep breath. "Auntie, I'm ready." And that was the moment I stepped back into my own life. Not to take revenge, but to stand tall, just as my parents once hoped. I once thought the day I returned to the old house where my parents had left me would make me tremble. 3 years ago, I was thrown out of my in-laws' house in the worst possible circumstances. Now I stood on that familiar street with a completely different feeling. I did not tremble. I was not afraid. I even felt strangely calm. The house that used to belong to my parents looks very different now. They had renovated it to their taste, replacing the doors, repainting, and placing a few expensive items on the porch. But no matter how many layers of outward change they applied, I still recognize the place. This is my family's house, not theirs. Aunt Helena walked beside me. Behind us were the 2 lawyers she had arranged. I could hear my heart beating, but not from worry, from the knowledge that I was doing the right thing. The lawyer knocked. After a moment, Margaret, my former mother-in-law, opened the door. When she saw me, she froze for a few seconds, then immediately covered her mouth and began to cry. "Emma, you're back? Oh my God, I'm so glad. I thought you disappeared." I stood tall and did not flinch. For the first time in my life, I looked her straight in the eye without feeling small. I spoke each word clearly, my voice steady and calm. "Mrs. Margaret, I am here today to reclaim what belongs to my family. This house is my parents' property. I will not argue. We have all the proper documents." The lawyer handed over the envelope of papers. Aunt Helena stood silent beside me, saying nothing, only looking at me with proud eyes. Margaret's expression changed immediately, but within seconds she began to cry louder and grabbed my sleeve. "Emma, please, you're mistaken. This house isn't what you think. We didn't do anything wrong." I took a gentle step back, not to pull away rudely, but to refuse to be dragged into that familiar performance any longer. I simply said, "Please don't cry in front of me anymore. Today I am not afraid of you." It was the truth. 3 years ago, her glances and voice could have crushed my heart. But today I stood here in a different role. Not the weak daughter-in-law, but a mother, an adult, someone about to reclaim her life. In that moment, I felt clearly, strength does not come from revenge. Strength comes from standing firm without harming anyone. I took a deep breath and continued, "I am not here to make things difficult. I am only exercising my rights. I ask that you respect that." Behind me, I heard Aunt Helena whisper, "You did very well, Emma." And for the first time in many years, I believed it. While my lawyer handled matters with the family, I saw Jacob standing at the end of the hallway. He said nothing, only looked at me with that familiar expression. The look of someone who wanted to come closer but wasn't sure he still had the right. When I turned to leave, he spoke. "Emma, can I have a moment to speak with you privately?" I glanced at Aunt Helena. She nodded slightly, as if to say, "You're strong enough." I walked out to the back porch and stood facing Jacob. The day was cold but pleasant. The distance between us felt cold in a different way. Jacob stood silent for a few seconds, then inhaled deeply. "Emma, I'm sorry. Everything that happened, it's my fault. I was weak. I let my mother influence me. I failed to protect you and our child. I know I don't deserve to say sorry, but I still want to say it." I remained quiet, not because I was angry, but because I had heard words like this too late for my emotions to be the same as before. Jacob continued, his voice trembling. I only want to ask one thing. If possible, let me see Lucas. Just once would be enough." I closed my eyes for a second. That request moved me, but it did not soften me the way it used to. I had grown. I understood what protecting my child meant. I answered slowly, "Lucas will see you when he's old enough to understand." Jacob bowed his head. I looked at him, and for the first time I no longer saw the man I once loved. I only saw someone bearing the consequences of his own weakness. I added, "Jacob, I do not seek revenge. I do not do that to anyone, but I must protect my son. Lucas spent the first 3 years of his life without a father. He is at peace. I will not allow anything to disturb that." He put his hands over his face. His shoulders shook slightly. I stood there, but this time I didn't break as I had 3 years ago. Nor did I feel fury. Only a calm, cool relief. The kind of feeling that comes when you have truly walked away from an old wound. Jacob looked up, eyes reddened. "I understand. Thank you for still being kind to me." I shook my head. "That's not kindness for you. It's kindness for my life and for Lucas. Everyone has the right to change, Jacob. If you really want to see him someday, start changing today." He nodded. No argument. No pleading. And I knew he understood. I am no longer the woman I was 3 years ago. The conversation ended in silence. But for me, it was not an ending. It was one door closing so another could open. Calmer. Brighter. On the day of the trial, I sat in the front row, directly in front of the prosecutor's table. Aunt Helena sat behind me, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder as a small, silent reassurance. I did not look toward my former in-laws. I had no reason to turn back. The courtroom that morning was more crowded than I expected. I focused on the front, listening to each point the prosecutor presented. The forged documents, the withdrawal applications bearing my forged signature, the fake psychiatric reports. Everything was laid out before the judge. I said nothing. I simply sat there and watched, as if I had finally stood where the light shone directly on the truth. When the judge picked up the final file, the whole room fell quiet. My heart pounded, but not out of fear, because I knew this would bring an end to the long shadow over my life. The judge's voice rang out clear and grave. "Defendant number 1, Mr. Raymond Collins, is found guilty of forging documents, conspiracy to appropriate assets, and bank fraud. The court sentences him to 11 years in prison." I heard Margaret, my former mother-in-law, sob behind me, but I did not turn. Defendant number 2, Mrs. Margaret Collins, is found guilty of the same charges with greater severity. The court sentences her to 14 years in prison. I remained sitting upright, my hands on my lap. I was not happy, nor was I gleeful. I simply felt light. Light as if at last I had put down the heavy stone I had carried on my back for 3 years. Next came Jacob's name. I held my breath. Defendant Jacob Collins. For cooperating with the investigation and admitting full responsibility, the court sentences him to 5 years probation and 1,000 hours of community service. I bowed my head slightly. I did not want him to go to prison. I only wanted him to learn the lesson life was forcing him to face. When the gavel fell and the session concluded, I stood up slowly. I did not glance back. It was unnecessary. Everything ended there, in the courtroom, not inside me. The lawyer asked if I wished to say anything before leaving the court. I only shook my head. I only want to go hug my son. I walked out of the courtroom feeling as though I had passed through a great storm. The courthouse corridor was long and bright, and when I pushed the door and stepped outside, the sunlight hit my face and made me pause for a few seconds. No one waited for me outside except Aunt Helena. She smiled. "It's done, Emma." I smiled back, a smile that felt surprisingly natural after such a long time. Yes, Now I just want to go hug Lucas. And I knew it wasn't the verdict alone that made me win. It was the fact that I stood up without revenge, without bitterness, choosing what was right. That was the true victory of my life. 2 years passed faster than I expected. Some mornings I wake up in my new home, the very house my parents left behind, and still can't believe I've come this far. I now run Land Pro Developments, the company my parents built. On my first day stepping into the conference room, I was so nervous I had to clench my hands just to stay steady. But over time, I realized I wasn't just replacing someone. I was continuing my family's dream. I worked hard. I listened to my employees. I tried to make everyone in the company feel valued. Whenever someone asked why I cared about every little detail, I remembered what Mrs. Hattie, the woman who helped me when I was at my lowest, once told me, "Don't forget, being strong doesn't mean standing alone. Being strong means respecting the strength of others." I carried that lesson into my management style. Maybe that's why the company grew more stable each day and why I matured with every decision I made. Lucas is 5 now. He's bright, energetic, loves drawing, and loves running around the backyard. Every morning, he gives me the tightest hug before going to school. He no longer asks about his father. To him, his whole world right now is me, our sunny, tiny home, and Aunt Helena, who always carries peppermint candy in her pocket. Aunt Helena has lived with us since the day she returned. She isn't just my guardian in matters of inheritance. She is genuinely a part of my family. Many evenings when I come home late and see Lucas sleeping on her shoulder, my throat tightens. My son has a safe harbor, and so do I. Sometimes, in quiet afternoons, while Lucas plays in the yard and Aunt Helena brews tea, I sit and look at the sky wondering, if I had chosen revenge back then, would my life be as peaceful as it is now? The answer is always no. I no longer resent anyone. I no longer hurt when I look back. I no longer fear the memories of those dark days. I just feel grateful. Grateful that I never let someone else's cruelty take away my own kindness. I often tell myself, forgiveness isn't because they deserve it, but because I need peace for my own life. And strangely enough, the more I learned to let go, the more beautiful things unfolded, far beyond anything I ever expected. As the days passed, Lucas grew, the company strengthened, and I learned an important lesson. Happiness doesn't come from returning pain. Happiness comes from choosing the kinder path, even when it's harder. That afternoon, the wind blew gently through the backyard. Once this garden was barren, but Aunt Helena and I replanted it, bed by bed, tree by tree. Now it has become my most peaceful corner. Lucas sat on the wooden swing I had recently repaired. He laughed with his eyes squinted, his legs kicking under the sunlight. I stood behind him, giving him a gentle push so he could go a little higher. Every time he laughed, something inside me softened in a way words can't capture. 2 years ago, I stood in this exact spot, but with a completely different heart. Now everything has changed. No more fear, no more loneliness, only peace, and the feeling of starting again. I watched Lucas run around the yard, then looked up at the sky, which had turned a soft shade of orange. Suddenly, I felt the urge to say thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to life itself. Thank you for letting me fall, but also letting me rise again. Thank you for taking so much away, yet giving me back things far more precious, strength, peace, and the love of my son. I turn to you, the one listening to my story, and I want to share something I've learned from everything I've been through. Family is precious, and kindness and compassion are always stronger than hatred. If I had chosen revenge back then, I wouldn't have the peace I have now. If I had let bitterness lead me, Lucas wouldn't have grown up in a home filled with love like today. I'm not perfect. I'm just a mother trying to do what's right. And I believe you are too. Each of us deserves a chance to begin again, to find happiness in our own way. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. If you enjoy real-life stories that are gentle and full of emotion like this one, feel free to subscribe so I'll have more motivation to keep sharing every day. Wishing you and your family peace. From the bottom of my heart, thank you.